I've had to do a lot of work in my life to be who I am today. I hope that Salish leaves a transformative legacy of bringing us back to our cultural values. I grew up in the reserve, the Seashell Nation. Probably the fondest memories that I had when I was a young boy was when my grandfather and my great-grandfather were fishermen. Part of my childhood was when they would come home from fishing. There was such a level of pride within the nation, and when the boats came in, it was like this huge celebration. It really brought community together. For me as a little boy to be around that part of our culture was so important. I look at today and, we've really lost connection to that. In a time of residential school and the impacts of residential school, it has taken us away from who we truly are. My mother was in residential school. My father was an English settler. My mother, because of residential school, had a tough time valuing herself. She was told by the nuns that she was less than a dog every day. So when I started understanding that and putting the pieces together in my life, I could understand why my mother wouldn't leave an abusive relationship, because, that's what she was told. We became victims of it. So for a long time, we really struggled as a family. My family still today struggles from alcoholism and drug addiction. And I always say Indigenous people don't start out at zero. We started at like -1,000. From -1,000 to zero is the healing work that has to be done just to get to zero. And I'm not saying Indigenous people are the only people who deal with this kind of stuff, but what I realized is that was prohibiting me from moving forward in my life. So the turning point for me was when my daughter was born. I certainly didn't want her to have the upbringing that I had and the challenges that we faced. The first thing I had to do is learn how to quit drinking and using drugs and understand why I was even doing that. Healing as well is looking at the dark parts of yourself that you really don't want to look at. Today I've tried to just be in service to anybody around me. When I look at the work that I do with Salish Soils is really just to be in service of a community. So I found it was symbiotic that I'd been doing this healing in my life, and the more that I was doing my own inner work, I'd started this company, Salish Soils. Some of the values come from my great-grandfather, Clarence Joe. He always talked about protecting our land and protecting our water, and it was very important for him to teach us all that, about the protection of our territories and our land. So when I was a young man in my early 20s, I was a logger. Years ago, when this thing was fell, they would put a notch in this tree and they would stuff a springboard in there, and they'd stand on the springboard and they'd fall the tree up here. This was a sign of the old times. My great-grandfather was a logger, and so was my grandfather. And this was the kind of stuff that they did. At that time, you look at it like it's a job. You were just grateful to have that work. And I can understand, how most people need that job to feed their family, but we're not looking at the environment. And I'm not saying that there's logging is bad. We need timber, we need lumber. And I think for us, as Indigenous people, is how are we looking at restoring that land, and how do you look at it 7 generations out? When I was in logging and forestry and then being in mining, I could see that we weren't fully protecting our land. I could feel that. If you allow a forest just to restore itself, it will. This tree was probably harvested about 40 or 50 years ago. So this thing is actually breaking down and turning into soil itself, right? That's what nature does, is it actually takes this and then it'll start recycling it. I always thought I would be doing something a lot more glamorous than dealing with biosolids and dealing with organic trash. But over time, you started looking at it differently. You start understanding that those are resources to being able to heal your land. All organic waste turned back into reusable compost was very much like what I was doing in my own personal life, turning my life into a valuable life. Whenever I'd go into the forest, I would start feeling like I was reconnecting with nature. I started understanding what my purpose was and why Salish Soils was born. The beautiful thing about what I'm doing today is just aligning with my purpose, with my inner values. The more that we started taking these resources and turning that into soil, I realized that soil is sacred.